The Firearms Control Amendment Bill is back in the news, as covered recently by the Cape Independent. We will link to the original article and reporting in the description below. But around the Firearms Control Bill, it has now languished at the National Economic Development and Labour Council, or NEDLAC for short, for more than 40 days as of mid-September 2025, helping us to figure out what is exactly in this so-called new piece of legislation, but which in many ways probably is just a rehash, and some of the implications as well as why it might be languishing at NEDLAC. We are joined by Mr. Gideon Joubert. Gideon, of course, a regular on the CRA channel. Gideon, a trustee of the South African Gunowners Association. Gideon, thank you very much for your time with us this week as we record on the 6th of October. We're coming closer and closer to the end of the year, and there is a bit of a concern that given, so much that has happened, not least of which this year, but I guess daily in South African and global politics, one loses sight of these many pieces of pernicious and possibly destructive legislation. That's why I think it's important for us to discuss it here once more. I think our last discussion might have been 3 or 4 months ago on a previous sort of iteration on this particular piece of legislation. But if you can just bring us up to date on particularly what this bill, at the high sort of macro level aims to target or aims to deal with. What is the supposed problem? Whenever there's a new piece of legislation, there's a supposed issue in society that government bureaucrats think they need to step in and deal with.
So thanks for having me back on, Chris. I'm going to dive right in and try and keep this as brief and concise as possible, and also give as much good and accurate information as I can. So there are many issues with this bill, from communications that Ian Cameron, who's the current chairman of the Police Portfolio Committee in Parliament, received from the minister. I believe it was the minister. It clarified that the bill presently sitting at NEDLAC is the same bill as the 2021 bill that's just been recycled. To bring people up to speed, what that bill contained is, amongst other things, it sought to ban self-defense as a reason for owning a gun in South Africa. It placed extreme and unworkable restrictions on the types of firearms and amount of ammunition that lawful firearm owners could legally own. It was a prohibition, I think, and there definitely is at present, from leaked communications from within NEDLAC, attempts at putting a prohibition on semi-automatic long guns, whether they're rifles or shotguns. Lots of implications regarding this, not just for private citizens, but for community safety, national security, and private security firms as well. What's interesting is that the minister's office admitted that they received about 118,000 comments on the previous iteration of the bill in 2021. I was still involved with Dear South Africa at the time, and I know that we submitted over 97,000 comments, unique individual comments, of which over 95,000 outright rejected the bill. So it was about a 96% rejection rate. I'd assume that however 100 and something thousand comments were truly received by the police, that rejection rate was about 96% as well. So not only was this one of the most, I believe the first or second most commented pieces of legislation in South Africa's history, amendment legislation history, it was probably one of the ones that was the most outright rejected by the general public, because that was an extensive rejection. So that's the one issue with it, is why is this thing recirculating and recycling, and by all implications and indications seeming to be getting worse, not being modified to make better. And when you have a piece of law that's this bad, you'd think rationally, you'd say, well, throw the thing in the bin. Let's start a brand new process, consult the stakeholders, and actually figure out what we're trying to do. Instead, it seems to be running roughshod over public rejection. And that's not the only problem it has. It's also an amendment bill that is outright defying the government's own commissioned research. Because prior to the 2021 bill, there was a wonderful piece of research that the Civilian Secretariat for Policing commissioned from the Wits School of Governance. It was published in 2015, and they looked at the effects of the Firearms Control Act of 2000 on violent crime rates for the 15-year period from 2000 to 2014. Now, a few things about this piece of research. Firstly, it was kept hidden from public view, and it required numerous prior applications from various stakeholder organizations to get it actually released in 2021. So government commissioned this research and then hid it from everyone. probably because the conclusions were not very favorable for what they wanted to do. I'll just go through a couple very briefly. By the way, I'm going to send you this document. You can find it pretty much everywhere. I have a link that the PDF I'm hosting on my own personal website for anyone who's interested. So I'll just send that to you, Chris, if you would like a copy of the PDF. But summary of the findings of the report in brief. The first one is crime rates have declined since the start of the FCA, judging from the decline in the rates from 2004 and 5 to 2013-14. However, there is little evidence that the FCA has caused a decline. The level of strong and sustained policing rather than the FCA is a necessary condition for reducing firearm-related crime. The FCA is not sufficient to reduce firearm-related crime in the absence of strong policing. Second conclusion, there are numerous. The FCA is relevant to less than 5% of all crimes reported to the SAPS. This percentage refers to violent crimes that could be related to firearms but do not necessarily entail the use of firearms. For example, in crimes of murder, firearms are only used about a third of cases. Thus, violent crimes should not be equated with firearms as they are often carried out with other weapons, and so on and so forth. Equally, the first recommendation made by the research paper is the following. Authorities need to shift their misplaced unconditional faith in the ability of the FCA to solve crime to policing. The FCA is not effective unless it functions under strong policing. And there was an additional one where further strengthening of gun control legislation was actually advised against. Here we go. On the amendments to the FCA, we need to realize that the population of legal firearm owners is aging, and increasingly stringent conditions for firearm licensing may be viewed as restricting their rights, their human rights to security. So the Wits School of Governance, it's this about 180-page research paper, very thorough. People who are interested in this, please go just read the summary findings and recommendations. It's very good. So you've got the state that's rejecting, or rather acting contrary to the public's rejection of this previous bill. They're going contrary to their own commissioned research, which is of high quality. And there also seems to be a strong divorce from reality, where we know there's about 2.5 to 3 million illicit firearms in circulation in South Africa right now. That's from the 2018 estimate of the Global Small Arms Survey. So they equal, if not exceed, the number of licensed firearms in circulation anyway. The big boogeyman that they like using is, well, we see lots of the guns entering the illicit market come from civilians who lose them or have them stolen. I looked at 10 years of SAPS data on this. If we ignore the firearm recovery rates by the police, there's only about a leakage of about 0.2% per year into that pool from civilian owners, including security companies and all sorts of other things. If you include recovery rates in it, that used to be up to 80-90%, that diminishes below 0.01%. The problem is our SAPS recovery rates of firearms are declining and have begun declining since 2018. And the reasons for that is because the SAPS is declining. Crime intelligence gathering is declining, visible policing is declining, crime detection is declining. The police is in a state of severe dysfunction. So we're not seeing these so-called firearm-related crimes being addressed with remotely the same effectiveness as more than a decade and a half ago. But the state is fixating very strongly on let's make more unworkable gun control legislation. And then the final one is from the credible source of the Global Initiative of Transnational Organized Crime, we got the expose last week that corrupt Namibian policemen are involved in smuggling military-grade arms and ammunition to Cape Flat gangs across the border. So we've got corrupt policemen in neighboring states smuggling guns and ammo to our criminals because guess what? It's a lucrative market, right? It's like any other thing where there's demand, supply will find it. And we haven't even opened the can of worms, which is 3D printing of firearms, which is a whole topic on its own. So I think what we're looking at here is an ideologically driven civilian disarmament agenda from the side of the ANC, who's becoming increasingly paranoid as it's losing its grip on power in South Africa politically. There is a severe dislike and distrust from the side of the ANC regarding any legally armed civilians in South Africa. That appears apparent regarding how they're acting. And fortunately, they are in decline, but also as a declining political force, they are also prone to doing increasingly stupid and crazy things. And I do believe from ANC insiders, there's a very strong desire from them to have this amendment bill pushed through before the end of this parliament in 2029. So civil society needs to sit awake.
No, absolutely. I think as we see in security, policing, and other many sectors, where current regulations, legislation fall short and one sees the consequences, it's almost this, let's just, the attitude seems to be, let's just try this harder. Let's double down. That'll fix the issue. It's not, the issue isn't that that our legislation and regulations were incorrect in the first place. It's just, we need to go harder in this direction. Gideon, if you can link this specific bill to what's going on around the private security industry, because we had recently the draft private security industry regulatory authority regulations. Is there any updates in that regard? Because one looks at it, it's similar in the sort of the current developments around expropriation, I think, and property rights, where property rights are attacked through various different kinds of legislation and through different proposed amendments. It's not just through the Expropriation Act, for example. It's other things as well. It's from national to provincial to municipal. So are you seeing a similar trend here that something like the Firearm Controls Bill, but also regulating the private security industry, that what is being proposed weakens those kinds of entities? And that's not to say that one, to try and steel man, I guess, what could be going on as well, to say, look, if you're going to have regulation, it should be as transparent and predictable and open as possible. But that's not what we're getting, I think.
No, you're absolutely right to bring that up, because there is certainly a connection. And when we looked at the regulatory amendments to the Private Security Regulatory Act, the SERA Act, what they would have done had they gone through was to effectively disarm or ban all sorts of armed response and armed asset protection and this sort of business. It would have knocked the legs out from underneath the entire industry with massive public safety and national security implications. And it's a similar what's happening to this sort of thing is we have these criminal groups, cartels, syndicates, very, very organized, almost an organized criminal industry that is doing exactly what they want with very little pushback from the state, and that their existence is used as an excuse to pour harder regulation on the actual law-abiding private sector and private individuals that are not in fact a threat to the state and that are victims of these groups, to leave them more vulnerable. So there seems to be this paranoid desire to impose only the state is allowed to have the monopoly on any type of force. The rest of civil society must submit to that and rely fully on the state for their protection. And the fact that the state is not only failing to protect them from organized criminal groups, but in so many cases colluding with them, well, that's just how it is. Unfortunately, we're no longer in a situation where we have to just accept that. But there is definitely a multi-pronged attack, not just on property rights, but also on individual private safety and security. And many people watching this say, well, okay, I'm not a gun owner and I might have armed response. Why is this important to me? And it's the fact that you as an individual might not be an individual gun owner or per se a big investor in private security. But if we can use the very tired but still effective metaphor of herd immunity, there are many people out there who very deeply subscribe to these things, who are building an antibody network, so to speak, that keeps bad crime out of where you are and as much away from you as possible. And by eroding the existence of these institutions, these individuals and these organizations, it's going to create a further massive security vacuum that will inevitably get filled by very bad people. And the best example of this, unfortunately, is to go down to any of our major townships and to just take a look at the township criminal economy, the extortion economy, what is being done to people there, where criminals essentially own and run the place, for want of a better word. Instead of pushing back on those elements, we are now going, the places that have managed to keep them out, there's going to be a creation of a vulnerability there as well.
I think on that point, we've seen in the last maybe 5 years, of course, we've seen the growth of the private security industry in terms of just pure numbers being, employing more people, I think, than SAPS and the SANDF combined. But if you look at in those more township areas where people, whatever disposable income they do still have, those few million South Africans who have a formal job, they try and pool those resources to do initiatives around sort of gated communities and erect booms and that kind of thing, where people try and have some kind of control over, the movement of people and making sure that they know what's going on in their neighborhood, and because then they can't rely on SAPs, for example. So it's frustrating, to put it very diplomatically, when one sees any kind of legislation that would make those kinds of things more difficult. When you see the growth of the private security industry, where yes, there might be weaknesses, there might be issues, but at least there's more competition and there's companies competing for your money as a customer. So if there's more of that, more innovation, that kind of thing, it does give people some options where they don't just have to rely on SAPs. Ordinarily, you would want, SAPs to be as fit for purpose as possible, but it's not reality. It doesn't help to wish things were different. You have to deal with reality as it is. Gideon, maybe a last point or last question, if I can ask you, sort of linking this to what's going on at the Madlanga Commission. We did talk, I think 2 or so months ago, Lieutenant General Mkonazi, when he first voiced his concerns and his allegations around top government leadership and links to criminal syndicates and criminal networks. Anything in how the Madlanga Commission is developing that you've been following or tracking that gives you, either as a red flag, so something along these lines of these pieces of legislation to watch, or that gives you the kind of feeling that there are people who have the right sort of ideas and are trying to do the right thing, that they're trying to stand up for South Africans and push back on crime, both in government and obviously in sort of the normal sort of syndicates and networks that we see?
I definitely think there are people that are trying to do the right thing, and it's great to see it happen. It's a frustrating process because, unfortunately, like all other commissions, the Madlanga Commission doesn't have any real teeth. But I think that's not why it's important. I think the reason it's important is because it's exposing reality that otherwise people may have had hunches or kind of intuitively knew to be true, but they didn't actually hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So this is where it's extremely important. And I think that what it's exposed to me is that we have high-ranking government officials that have direct ties to organized, very violent criminal groups and the criminal economy. Its tentacles everywhere in this country, and that these people very much would love to see ordinary civilians disarmed and make sure they don't have access to guns, because it makes the jobs of their criminal associates so much easier and so much more lucrative, and it allows them to actually occupy you almost as an occupying force and extract value from you and other members of the productive economy without any threat of repercussions or consequences. And I think that is, if I had to try and give people a wake-up call, why opposing this type of legislation with regards to gun control, we're opposing unworkable regulations of the private security industry, why that matters to people who aren't themselves gun owners, and why it matters to people who aren't in the private security industry. This legislative push is an attack on your ability to actually do business, be safe, and own property. And the time will come where we need more people's voices and inputs on this. By the way, everyone knows I'm almost like a Second Amendment absolutist. The problem is, if we didn't have gun control in South Africa, I'd be completely bankrupt because I would be spending all my money on guns I can't afford. But even if you do not agree with me on that, there are many touch points where we can point out the irrationality of these things and the extremely bad negative consequences they have: public safety, national security, and economic prosperity. So, yeah.
It's a very good note on which to wrap up. So lots going on in different avenues, I think, and important to try and track as much as possible and then link it together. Legislation doesn't happen, I think, in isolation. There's always an ideological underpinning, and it helps to understand, I think, that background. And then we can effectively push back however, one chooses with one's resources, one's level of commitment. Any kind of pushback, I think, does help, and it does sort of add up over time. So, Gideon, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for all the work you do. To everyone who joined us for this discussion, thank you very much for your time. If you haven't yet, before you leave, please like this video. Always helps the algorithm. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.